Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ben. Thank you for coming today. So today's session is Strengthening the Strong, an introduction to assessment and strengthening exercises for patients or athletes with non-specific low back pain. So the learning outcomes for today, I'd like you, at the end of the session, you will be able to identify imbalances in muscle strength of the trunk and proximal joints in relation to back pain. You'll be able to teach an exercise to increase gluteal muscle strength with minimal co-contraction of the spinal flexors and extensors, and it will also consolidate your knowledge of the relevant anatomy. Big warning sign. So remember, athletes can have things that aren't non-specific back pain. We can have systemic masquerades, we can have inflammatory disease, and we can have neurological problems as well. Always worth obviously doing a full assessment. We're all physios, we know that. Strength and conditioning coaches as well. If they're speaking about someone with back pain, remember to mention that we're here. So we're going to kick off with a little knowledge test. You've all done your pre-reading. So anatomical planes of movement. Can someone tell me an anatomical plane?
Transverse plane.
Transverse plane, excellent. So how would you describe the transverse plane? What does it divide?
Across.
Top half to bottom half. Call that together, lads. Brilliant. Okay, and then if we, another one, Ming?
Sagittal plane.
Sagittal plane, great. And how would you describe how that splits the body?
Left and right.
Yeah, brilliant, into left and right. And then Lee?
Coronal plane.
Coronal plane, excellent. And
Also
how would that divide
known
the
as
body?
the frontal plane.
Excellent. And how would that divide the body?
That will split it between anterior and posterior.
Excellent. Brilliant. So you can see a little diagram there, nicely brings it all together. So we're going to talk about the coronal plane first. So the joints that would move in the coronal plane, any ideas? Any again? Ming, to begin?
Joints.
Joint that would produce movement in the coronal plane.
Glenohumeral joint.
Excellent, yeah, so the shoulder joint. And which movement would that be?
Abduction, adduction.
Yeah, excellent, good. And then if we're thinking about the shoulder, then also obviously the hip is going to move in similar directions. Again, abduction, adduction, these are the movements that we're looking at. You'll also obviously get your fingers as well, and wrists. So to produce movement through the spine, you would get unilateral co-contraction of the spinal flexors and extensors on that side, relying on relaxation of the other side. Movement in the sagittal plane. Danny?
Limb flexors.
Limb flexors, excellent. So whether that be the leg or the arm, brilliant. So obviously you can at the glenohumeral joint and the elbow joint, pretty much all the joints down the limb, and then also on the leg as well. So again, the movements in that plane. Lee?
Flexion and extension.
Yes, yeah, flexion, extension, excellent. So obviously you get that from spinal flexors or the spinal extensors working bilaterally. Transverse plane. Anyone want to shout out? Movements in the transverse plane.
Hip.
Hip, yes, and which movement would that be?
Medial and lateral rotation.
Excellent, so that would be rotation about that plane. Then we've also obviously got those muscles working to these movements here. Alright, so we've got our horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. Okay, that's going to look great on the video.
Yeah.
So with unilateral spine extensors that co-contracting with contralateral spinal flexors, you're going to produce movements rotating in that plane as well. Okay, so we're going to move on to the multi-plane balance assessment next. Why are we looking at this then? We're trying to identify relative strengths and weaknesses in the body, which is going to show up different potential balance deficits. If you've got a balance deficit, you could say that you may have a coordination insufficiency. All right, so a balance deficit would show movement going wrong, movement fault, shall we say, through maybe even as little as one joint. If you've then got a coordination insufficiency, it might be a little more difficult to recover from that. And then you'd be looking at compensatory strategies if you're taking it kind of to the next level. And all of that comes back down to muscle imbalance and asymmetries across a joint or number of joints. Okay, so the method. So we're going to do a little demo now. So I'm going to need one of you as a model. Any volunteers? Danny, excellent. So if you can take a step forward, please. Now you would, typically in clinic, you would obviously do this being able to view what's going wrong. So ideally it would be sort of t-shirt off into shorts, with your socks and shoes off. Obviously that's going to change the contact that your feet, the proprioception around your feet. So we're going to start off in standing, perfectly modelled. Shoulders are going to go to 90 degrees. You might just want to take a step forward actually, Danny, just give you a little bit more room. That should be just about enough. Brilliant. So we're going to take shoulders to 90 degrees abduction. Good. We're then going to take the weight-bearing leg into neutral, as it is. We're going to take the non-weight-bearing hip up to 90 degrees with the knee at 90 degrees as well. Brilliant. So from here, we can make initial observations. Not a lot going on here, truth be told. So we start to introduce movement in each of those planes that we spoke about. So we're going to start out with movement in the transverse plane at the arms. I'm going to take an arm forward for me, Danny. And it's going to go up towards the ceiling. And it's going to go back down towards the side. So we've already addressed transverse coronal and sagittal plane movement. We've started to see something. Right, we're going to do it with the other arm. It's going to come across you. It's going to go up. And it's going to go down to the side. Brilliant. Good. So now we're going to address the lower limb. Already we're making some observations. The knees started to lower. And we've got a little bit of hitch in here we can see as well. I'm going to bring that knee up for me. And I'd like you to straighten that knee out in front of you. Excellent. And then I'd like you to take the leg out behind you and lean forward as if you were doing sort of an arabesque movement or a single leg RDL. Great. And we've lost balance. Okay, so already then we've got a clue as to which plane we lose stability in and as to which muscles we might have to work on to get in stronger. Okay, great. So we're nearly finished. We've just got to do a couple more items in that test. So you can take your shoulders back up to 90 for me, weight-bearing leg in neutral, and your non-weight-bearing leg up to 90 at the knee and hip. Good. So I'd now like you to rotate around to your right. Going to go that way. Good. Using your whole body. And then I'd like you to rotate back. We're going to go all the way around the other way. Excellent. Using the whole body. Coming back. And then you can put your foot down and you've completed the test. You then go on to repeat that test. You can sit down again, Danny. On the other side. So you're looking at, like I said, imbalances maybe, perhaps on the one leg. Then also the asymmetry compared to the other side. So yeah, like I said, we're looking at arm movements in the transverse coronal sagittal planes, just to recap. Non-weight bearing leg movement in the coronal and sagittal planes. What we didn't do actually was that you can add like an abduction element to that. You can take it out in the transverse plane. And then weight bearing hip trunk movement in the sagittal plane and rotation about the vertical axis. Great, so upper limb observations. Did either of you have anything spring to mind when you watched Danny with the upper limbs? You didn't have to. I'm just wondering if you did. No. Okay. So common things that we might observe. We might see scapular elevation of one side. So we see that as a common strategy to try and gain stability. Humeral adduction. So you might see the arm come down. And then finger abduction. Again, sort of splaying. So if we're linking that back to anatomy, any idea why we might adduct the shoulder? I'm going to ask you then. I'm going to ask you first, which muscle adducts at the shoulder? Humeral joint. Adducts, adducts.
Lower traps.
And
lats.
Lats. Yeah. So lats is a good one. Lats is a good one for the purpose of this. And what do you know why it might why lats might sort of start to activate in that position? If you think back to maybe your slings, myofascial slings.
To regain balance.
Yep, so certainly a coping strategy. And what we might see is if you're weak about one muscle group at one end of a sling, if we say the gluteals on that weight-bearing leg, if we're then trying to create stability by drawing in here, we're creating tension across that sling. So we're essentially energizing, term that I've heard before, the sling on the other end of on the other end. Okay, so that's why we kind of get these coping strategies. There's weakness in one place, we energize somewhere else. Okay, great. So trunk observations. And so the main thing we saw there was a little bit of side flexion. When Danny first took his left arm up to abduction, so a little bit of side flexion going on, and that was again sort of due to trying to regain his stability. When we also saw, you might see lumbar extension, cervical protraction. Again, so the reason for that, if you're thinking about the glutes, perhaps not being quite sufficient at that point in time, you'll go into a bit more extension. You won't be able to tuck under quite as well. Pelvic tilt and rotation, again, just that coordination or lack of strength around the pelvis. And then we might see even ribs remaining static. The reason for that, trying to hold your breath. Holding your breath to try and gain stability. Okay, so fixing in the upper quadrant. And lower limb observations. So any typical lower limb observations that you might see in someone with a balance deficit, Lee?
Knee valgus, knee varus,
Yes.
hip rotation,
Yep.
lateral rotations.
Yep, so that sort of compound that we tend to see, certainly. Now the main point when we started to see compensations with Danny was when he came forward into that arabesque movement, and it sort of started to go, didn't it? So you might then be suspecting muscles around the hip, the rotators starting to sort of give first at that point. Yeah, then you've also got your ankle eversion, midfoot pronation, as you part of that kind of valgus collapse, as it's termed, and then toe flexion, gripping. So again, that would show potentially a more proximal weakness where you're trying to create your stability further away from the body. On the non-weight bearing leg, we might see hip adduction, so coming across. Again, sort of your adductors trying to grip on. Internal rotation, again part of that almost mechanism there coming across, and extension as well. So it dropping out. So we saw a little bit of weakness potentially through the hip flexors. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is get you doing this. I want to see one of you assess the other. I'd like to see what your observations are. Okay, so Danny's already modelled, so it might benefit Danny to watch. So am I right to get one of you to assess the other? I'll let you choose who's doing what.
Do you want to assess me, Ming?
Yeah, that's
It's a
fine.
bit good for both of
Okay.
us learning.
Great. Now, I mean, you've got your method there.
Okay.
So you don't have to remember the method. I don't expect you necessarily to remember that whole thing just from doing that. We covered some info after. This is a point where it's meant to help you learn, so you've got it, you can experience it. All right. I'll stand out your way.
Okay. So just have your arms in 90 degree abduction and raise your left knee up into 90 degree hip and knee flexion. Right. So there's a bit of trunk movement on coronal plane
Yeah.
now. And can you raise your left arm up in that way and then back, and try on the other side.
Okay. Good. You carry on, Ming. Danny, what are you observing?
A little bit of extension, so like a bit more lordosis from his
Yeah.
into that.
Great.
Obviously on that right hand side.
Good spot. I mean, it's all going to be subtle observations when we've got a fully dressed subject, but it's again for the purposes of today, that's fine.
Right.
Okay, carry on, Ming.
Can you
He's doing well.
straighten your leg for me? And then bring it back. And rotate to the side all the way.
There we go.
And to the other side. So he's dropping.
Oh, crap.
He's doing well. He's doing well.
Cramp.
That was quite Ming. Good. And you can see that side flexion coming in again.
Flexion was
Yeah.
strong, compensate. Right, and then go forward.
Nicely done.
Practice.
Good.
Great. No, good observation there. That's good. Well done. I'll let you can both sit back down.
Dangerous, this exercise coming in the morning.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is move on to the foot press. So this is a strengthening exercise mainly for the gluteal muscle. Now, this is very stripped back. What we're trying to do, like I said, is isolate almost the gluteals, but it's an isometric exercise in a functional pattern, as opposed to say a glute squeeze, which is shown to give great EMG sort of feedback. It's shown to activate really well the glute max. This exercise is sort of with the effort of trying to produce movement, as opposed to your glute squeeze, which isn't. Now, with this, and again, I'd like someone to teach, so I'm going to go for Ming this time. If I can get you to take your shoes off, please, Ming, and I'd like you to lay on your back on here. I'm going to grab your pillow. Okay, so we're in crook line to begin with, so if Ming, you could bend your knees and hips. Excellent. So, great start. The next thing is to, we're going to be pressing each foot alternately into the mat. Okay, so we're going to go left, then we're going to go right. The reason we do that is to instantly get a feel for one compared to the other, so we're looking at that asymmetry. Okay, we're going to be trying to isolate activation to your lower limbs. This is great speaking to a physio like this. And therefore trying to avoid recruitment of your trunk muscles, all right, spinal flexors and extensors. The greatest effort should be going through your gluteals, and it's a submaximal exercise. Okay, we're not going for full throttle here. We're trying to isolate, we're trying to avoid the co-contraction. Therefore, we're using a lower force. Okay, so your main teaching points for this. You want to be gauging their proprioception. So instantly, objectively, you can observe what's going on, so visual feedback. So, Ming, what I'd like you to do then is start to press your left foot into the mat. Okay, good, and then you can relax. I'd like you to press your right foot into the mat, and then you can relax. Great, so as you can see there, not a lot to observe on me. We didn't see much at all. Something that you'd be looking for in clinic, again, maybe with the sort of top off, you might see things like bracing of the abdomen if they're trying quite hard. You might be seeing movement across of the knees as they try and work out which muscles they need to use. Remember, this person's likely to be in pain, and you can sometimes get those confused messages sent out. And you can often see quite a bit of toe gripping as well, or even extension, where they're not quite feeling the mat. So the things, different prompts you can give to try and influence a correct method. You might want to say to soften the tummy. Often if you say relax to people, try to relax, sort of counterintuitive. You might want to say visualize big feet if they're starting to grip or starting to extend through the toes, so that'll allow them to sort of soften and to spread. And if you see that they're making all of these compensations, you might want to suggest to them to just use less effort. If we're working at about a 30% effort, from experience, tends to sort it out. Okay, so then from there, the common observations. So I've spoken about the abdominal bracing, I've spoken about the toe flexors, and I've spoken about hip movement in the coronal plane. The other thing you might see is neck flexors. So if you see someone really trying hard, you can see SCM often fire off. Again, it's just a case of them, say, melting into the mat. Is a good one as well, just to try and cause a lower global tone is what we're essentially trying to get here. So I mean, you actually did it really well, and you gave me very little work to do there. But this is all the things that could have happened. So common feedback. So the other thing you want to do, other than just observe what's going on, you want to gauge their feedback from the exercise, what they're feeling. Typical things we might find. Well, Ming, how did it feel for you? Let's ask you. Did you notice any difference between your two sides? You can have another go. Did it feel any different in different places?
I felt there was more contraction at my hamstring instead of glute.
Okay, and which side was that?
right side.
On your right side, okay. So what we'd do then is work on that essentially. So that's what we might get. Harder to do on a symptomatic side. So you found it harder just to use the glutes on that side essentially. You found that you would end up co-contracting through more of your posterior chain. Back tightening on the symptomatic side is a big one. If they've got low back pain, if there's an element of muscle spasm in that, then they're going to find it hard to relax that off. But often with the coaching, with the teaching, they will do. And they're often unaware of the common observations actually. So they're often unaware that they're gripping or extending through their toes. They're often unaware that they're bracing through the trunk, and often unaware that they're bracing up through the neck as well. And just by giving those prompts, you can often then help them get better at the exercise rather than just things that they can notice. So the aims of this then are to increase strength of the gluteals in isolation, to improve coordination of the posterior chain in the role of isometric hip extension, and to improve proprioception of the lower limb, i.e. knowing which muscles are working at what time. There are progressions there, but before we go on to that, I'd like to see one of you teach the other. So I'd like now to see Danny teaching Lee how to do this exercise, if that's all right with you two. I think you'll like to step off and you can watch it being taught. So again, you've got your remember you've got all your prompts there, so you can feel free to use those.
Come have a little lie on your back, please. Can you bend both your knees first, please? Fantastic, thank you. Okay, what I'd like you to do, Lee, okay, is I want you to, we're going to do left foot first, then right foot, okay, and what I want you to do is I want you to try and squeeze your foot into the bed for me. So push your foot into the bed, good, and then the other side for me, good, and then go again for us. Can you do 5 each side for us? Good.
Okay, so I'm just going to come around the front here and just observe what's going on.
Make sure you visualise big feet for us, so don't try and curl those toes for us, Lee.
Good, well done.
And soften that tummy as well, okay? Fantastic.
Excellent, so yeah, you spotted that, just Lee's tummy rising slightly as he was pushing through one foot.
All those big breakfasts.
And what's that other cue then? If you're watching that global tone rise, what might be happening there,
I
Danny?
just want you to feel like you're melting into the metal for us, Lee, okay? Just feel yourself melt.
Good, so a soft tone of voice always helps as well, me. To lower that global tone. If you think you shout at someone, tone raises.
Well done.
Okay, well done, Danny. Good stuff. Right, so you can all take a seat then. Okay, so yeah, well done everyone. Some nice observations being made there. What I definitely encourage is you to go away and practice these again. Before we get to that though, just to give you an idea, to give you some context to this, obviously you've all got decent backgrounds in exercise anyway, and I don't want to feel like you're teaching you to suck eggs. It's nothing revolutionary, it's just a basic movement pattern stripped down. So you'll probably notice that you were pushing through one leg at a time. Now if you were pushing through 2 legs at a time, it'd be a bit like an isometric bridge. Okay, we can then make that into a full bridge. If you think of what we're trying to introduce there, we were trying to reduce tone across the centre, across the trunk. So if you were trying to really work through your gluteals, if you got them to lead through the hips, then they're not going to be arching their spinal they're arching through the back. They're not going to be extending through the trunk. They're not going to be working those extensors. Okay, so that's a good way of getting them to loosen off around the centre while working more through the hips, to lead with the hips, to almost kind of peel away. A bit like lifting a string of pearls off your bedside table, so we call that the string of pearls bridge. Okay, you could then make that perhaps a little bit more akin to, say, walking, if you were to do a long lever style bridge using the same cues. So you can imagine when you're making foot contact with the ground, your knee and hip are in a lot more extension than what you're doing on that table when we're doing the basic foot press. So if you're doing alternate legs, or even going onto that long lever bridge with your knees and hips in more extension. The key here is though making sure you maintain the cues. Obviously you make it harder, your global tone is going to rise, But if they can still sort of tap into the idea that they're mainly working through the gluteals and they're trying to reduce their overall tone through the trunk and through the rest of the posterior chain, then you're still on to achieving what you want to achieve. You can also then try a gym ball under the feet. That's going to obviously reduce their stability, and they're going to have to work harder on terms of proprioception. We also know that using an unstable surface under limbs when we're doing these exercises will work your gluteals more, okay, your glute max. There's studies show out there again with upper limb as well. If you add a Bosu ball to your, I think it's your push-up, then or even just some upper limb weight bearing, then it actually stimulates pec major to work more as well. So it's working on that similar basis. You also got single leg variations as well, as I've already kind of said. And in any of those, you can add resistance again to try and increase your load and your effective strengthening. So just practical suggestions then. We're looking to maintain cueing during resistance training movements with a reduced load or reduced range. And when I say that, I mean like your typical pre-existing S&C routine. Okay, so your squats, maybe your deadlifts. You're still going to coach those with some co-contraction. We know that if we're lifting something heavy to support the passive stability, we don't want to rely on passive stability. We're going to want to use the trunk muscles. But again, it's maybe that ratio that we're looking at of what's working when. And then in your routine training drills as well. Perhaps in a game, you wouldn't be telling them to do things thinking about what they're working. You just want them to get on with it and you want them to do it well. But perhaps so you can take them into, say, a big space and break down the troublesome aspect of a training drill, something that they've been finding difficult when they've been getting pain, their aggravating factor, and then building again around it as the technique improves. Okay, so feedback then. How did you guys feel when you were doing your assessment, when you were doing your teaching? Anything particularly positive or negative?
Do you mean on our aspects of teaching?
Yeah, how you felt when you were teaching it. I get that you didn't have long today and that it's put you on the spot a bit, but was there anything that you felt like you still need to know from this?
Sorry, need to know about the subject or about my teaching someone the exercise?
About teaching the assessment and teaching the exercise.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's good that you can go through like a method and understanding once you've got sort of, I suppose, some sort of objective way of measuring everyone the same side way, but at the same time it's pretty subjective.
Yes.
Practitioners.
Yes. Yeah.
Something where you might say, "Can you see that?" or "I might not be able to see that."
Yeah. You are. You're gonna potentially get differences from person to person. It does rely on how. I think the more you get used to it, the more you're gonna be able to observe. You're not so worried about what you should be looking for. You just kind of see it. So I wouldn't expect it to be to each of you to have observe exactly the same thing straight away. But hopefully anything obvious is obvious. So that's the main purpose of it. The other thing is obviously this is an introduction, and there is a lot more to, as you'll know yourselves, there's a lot more to back pain than what we've just done now. But other things that you can pick up, obviously there are other exercises that are going to be more beneficial. So perhaps this would have been better if someone was particularly struggling with, from your observations, compensating by working through the spinal extensors too much, or perhaps the hamstrings too much, and you'd identify, say, a gluteal weakness, glute max weakness. Okay, great. Any other questions?
How could you make it easier? So
Make
we're
what
standing on one leg looking at the movement controls, we're in the arm movements. What if somebody's really struggling just with a single leg balance?
Okay, so you'd just take it back essentially. What this was guided for is for athletes who are going to be able to do this sort of thing. If your balance assessment wasn't appropriate, then you'd look at, again, easier things that you already know and can do.
So where you said your assessment in standing is very aimed towards athletes because you expect them to do it. and then your sort of treatment assessment where they're on their back, I would probably say every single one of our athletes would be able to do that. So for me, if you've got someone that walks through a door and they say, this happened, let's say rugby playing, deadlifts 150 kgs, he's fully training, he's fully playing, but we're going to go lying down his back and see whether he can contract his glutes and stuff. Is there some...
It's how he produces it. So what the reason you'd give that exercise is if you could see through that assessment and through that doing that exercise that you struggle to isolate, say, his gluteals from, say, spinal extensors or his hamstrings. And what you're looking to do is re-educate the use of the muscle more in isolation, increase the awareness of how they're working. If you think that some of the cause of the pain is because the tone is higher
So
through the painful area.
is it an assessment